Hello, my name's John Newlands, and I'm going to talk about a man called Robert Fleming. He lived from 1845 to 1933, and he's been described as an entrepreneur, a benefactor, and a Dundonian. If I can encapsulate Robert Fleming's career into just a few lines, he left school at the age of 13 to start as an office boy on a salary of £5 a year. He then had a very successful career in finance. When he died in 1933, he left more than £2 million, which is the best part of 160 million in today's values. And as a sort of epilogue, many years later, the merchant bank, which bore his name, Robert Fleming and Co., was sold to the Americans for $7 billion in year 2000. So I'd like to take you back to Dundee in the middle of the 19th century. Now, there were several things going for Dundee at that time. The first was agriculture, fruit farming in particular, but it also had shipping and it had the textile industry. So the ships brought the jute in from the Indian subcontinent. The jute was processed by the whale oil because Dundee also had a huge Arctic whaling fleet at that time. And then the textiles that were produced by the mills were then exported around the world, and the ships would then perhaps carry another cargo from the eastern seaboard of the United States out to India or wherever it might be. So the end result of this was that Dundee became one of the wealthiest cities in the British Empire, if not the world at that time. By the 1860s, more than 40,000 tons of jute were coming in per year, and demand soared in times of war and in the US Civil War in particular. At the height of the industry, there were 62 jute mills in Dundee, employing more than 50,000 people. And as I say, this created a great deal of wealth for investment. Now, turning to young Robert Fleming, Robert was born in Lochee in very harsh circumstances. He was one of 7 children, 5 of whom died at a very young age from diphtheria. So he came from a very difficult background, a very poor background. He left his first school at 11, but he got a scholarship to go to another school, Dundee High School, via a charity called the James Webster Bequest. And it turned out young Robert was good at mathematics and was marked out as being bright. So, as I said earlier, Robert left school at 13, and he was effectively an office boy, a messenger based around the old Cowgate Market area of Dundee. And I'd just like to read out a piece from the Dundee Yearbook 1915. The old Cowgate Market was a confederacy of chiefs, of confidentials, of clerks and of juniors. The newest and most youthful men on the market seem to be the most important, and there are jute lords today who must tremble when they recall of their youthful boasting. Now, young Robert's career soon started to develop, and 2 years later he joined Cox Brothers, the massive jute textile conglomerate which owned the Camperdown Works in Dundee. And that site was so big it covered 30 acres, had its own railway line, and employed 4,500 people. Fleming was now getting a glimpse of a very different world. Among other things, the clerks kept the investment portfolios, and these were kept in locked files, which the partners administered for the firm and for themselves. Soon he was taking an interest himself in stock market matters, and he made a list of all the new issues coming out onto the market. And meanwhile, he was starting to do well, he was starting to earn more money, and by the time he was 20, he was earning £100 a year, which was a lot of money then, given that his father, for example, who was an overseer in a jute mill, never earned more than £1 a week in his life. And all the while, young Fleming was pushing himself forward, and this is one of the things that intrigues me and why really I've made a study of him, is that he pushed himself forward at every opportunity. He was also extremely athletic and sporting. Rowing he liked. He took boxing lessons as a younger man. He would go to every lecture going, the theatre. He was in the volunteer reserve, the Territorial Army, modern terminology. And he'd even do things like studying the art of conversation. And in his diaries, it was found that he'd instructed himself as follows: I really must study the art of conversation. On thinking over what I'd said, I found I had not entered, as I thought, into subjects of a literary character, nor endeavoured to find out the pursuits and pastimes of Mr. Lang, in talking of which he would have felt at home. Now, on top of all these things Robert was doing to improve himself, people worked a 6-day week in those days, and at the weekend, he and his brother thought nothing. On a late Saturday afternoon, they'd get the train to Blairgowrie, and then they'd walk either 11 or 13 miles, depending which grandfather they were going to go and stay with. And then on the Monday morning, they'd have to be up sufficiently early to walk that distance back again to get the dawn train back to Dundee to go to work. By this stage, Robert was, as he said in a letter many years later, seeing before me illimitable wealth. He began to subscribe for new issues against a backdrop of rising financial markets. And this is where he suffered this harsh early lesson which never left him for the rest of his life. In London, one of the biggest banks at that time, over in Gurney, failed in 1866. This was the first and original Black Friday. That collapse took with it many other firms, including one called the Oriental Commercial Bank, in which Robert had invested £40. The trouble was that in those days you subscribed part paid, and he actually owed the bank, which had collapsed, and had to pay another £160 to help pay the bank's debts. So he'd wiped out 2 years' salary at a stroke. And it took him 5 years to pay off what he owed. And as I just described, this harsh lesson, I think, served him well in later life, because he became one of the most prudent investors there's ever been. Before the end of 1866, Robert Fleming left Cox Brothers to work for another textile firm, Edward Baxter and Son, and he became the confidential clerk to Mr. Baxter himself. Now, Mr. Baxter was the vice consul for American vice consul for the area, as well as being involved in a great deal of trade and investment in the United States. And I'm convinced that Robert learned a great deal from Mr. Baxter before Baxter died at the age of 80 in 1871. Meanwhile, Robert's ambitions were in full flow, and he had seen an advertisement in the local press. And this reported the success of the Foreign and Colonial Government Trust in London. And he decided he was going to persuade some of the wealthiest men in Dundee to launch his own version of such a fund. So while it might come as a shock to certain of my colleagues in Scotland that the first investment trust of all was not founded in Scotland, it was founded in London, and that it was copied by Fleming in Dundee, he took the best idea out there and developed it. And I think this is the hallmark of the entrepreneur that I'm trying to describe to you. I've got a quote here where he describes the difficulties he had in persuading people to go for this idea. I kept nagging 4 leading local men until in 1873, with much fear and trepidation, the Scottish American Investment Trust was floated with a capital of £150,000. So this shows he had to nag and push the senior, older and much richer businessmen to support his idea, but they did go for it, and the Scottish American Investment Trust was launched in 1873. I'm not going to dwell on that particular episode because there's another talk in the Library of Mistakes series by Claire Anderson, who in June 2019 described these investment trusts, but put it like this: there were 3 issues of the Scottish American Investment Trust. They were hugely successful in investing in the United States, despite various panics and crises going on over there at that time. And those 3 vehicles effectively still exist today. They merged into one in 1970, but they've survived every crisis in financial history and in global history, and still exists today in the form of Dunedin Income Growth Investment Trust, which is managed by Aberdeen Standard Investments as we speak. One of Robert's hallmarks and strengths is that he believed in putting feet on the ground and going to see where the money was being invested. And as a consequence of that, he ended up crossing the Atlantic 64 times each way over the course of his life. But as the Dundee Courier of 23rd June 1923 mentioned, looking back at Fleming's life, had Mr. Fleming sailed on the Thursday, it's not likely that he should have crossed the Atlantic 128 times. Because he'd originally been his original booking had been made on a ship called the Royal Mail ship Atlantic, which struck rocks and sank off the coast of Nova Scotia with a loss of 560 lives. He didn't go on that one in the end. He went on a ship called the SS Abyssinia. And I've reflected that in those days, these trips would have to be at least a couple of months in total duration, and some of them were longer than that. So if he did that 64 times, Robert must have spent 10 years of his working life, in transit to and from America. Over the next few years, Robert remained as secretary of the three trusts, and he also built up a thriving business dealing in securities for himself and for his clients. His finest hour, it's said, although I don't intend to go into it now, came in 1876 when he represented the bondholders of the Erie Railway, a company notorious for financial mismanagement, facing down the great J.P. Morgan himself in a successful reorganisation of the railroad. On the personal front, Robert married Kate Hindmarsh, the daughter of a senior Inland Revenue official from Granton-on-Spey, in February 1881. They would go on to have 4 children, Valentine, Kate, Dorothy and Philip. And it was Valentine who tragically was killed in the First World War, who was the father of Ian Fleming, the James Bond author. Fleming's gradual move to London, in business terms at any rate, was headlined by the launch of the Investment Trust Corporation in 1888, and of which he'd remain a director until shortly before his death in 1933. His family moved south at very much the same time in 1889, initially to a large house in Kent and subsequently to the 2,000-acre Nettlebed estate in Oxfordshire. Fleming's numerous enterprises had continued to thrive, and his original biographer, Bill Smith, was given access to Fleming's locked private ledgers dating to 1901. At that date, Robert had capital of £810,000, equivalent to perhaps 50 million today, while his dealing profits for that year came to 66,000, to which were added interest and dividends of almost another 47,000. It was around this time that he started making sizable grants. For example, he created or financed a chair at University College Dundee in physiology, paid for a gymnasium, and many other bequests, some of which, in fact, most of which, I think he just kept quiet about. In 1904, Robert Fleming recruited a young Scottish accountant called Walter Wigham as assistant. Within 5 years, he was so impressed that he made Wigham, together with Fleming's eldest son, Valentine, founding partners in the embryonic firm of Robert Fleming and Co. Robert had 50 shares and the others had 25 each. But the articles of that business that laid down the rules stated, for example, that no partner other than the said Robert Fleming shall manage in any private speculation on his own account. So he continued to keep close control of everything that was happening until the end. By way of my final statistic, it's been estimated that by 1928, Fleming had a strong personal influence and no fewer than 56 investment trusts capitalised at £115 million. I'm going to sign off now from the various business milestones in his life, and I'm going to turn by way of aside to another event with a link to our story, namely the sinking of the Titanic. The Royal Mail ship Titanic sank on 15th of April 1912. Now, as it happened, the Scottish Investment Trust had several sackloads of coupons on board the Titanic. And I'd just like to read you out this quote. These items were, of course, fully insured. 11 days later, the underwriters paid out the full amount. The company's officers, its friends and correspondents, were constantly on these great ships, and while they expressed their thankfulness that there was no loss to mourn, they desired also to convey their sympathy with the many who'd been less fortunate. The point I draw from this is, and I believe this was stemmed from Robert Fleming's meticulous attention to detail, who'd have thought to insure these share coupons that were crossing the Atlantic? And secondly, which insurance company today would pay you out in full in 11 days? So that was typical of his attention to detail. Right, well, moving towards the end now, but how did Robert Fleming succeed? How did he avoid, if you like, a Titanic failure? Well, I've listed several bullet points here, and I'm just quickly going to run down them. His early ambition, drive, and quest for self-improvement were absolutely exceptional. He believed, as I do, in personal original research. He'd be up on the railroads in the US, finding out whether those railroads were real, whether they'd been built to the extent that was being stated, and whether the investment was any good. He did that time and time again. He insisted on certain investment criteria. For instance, he wouldn't invest in new and unproven railroad lines, that he would invest in an existing line that was already paying dividends and perhaps needed to raise some more money. He believed in confidentiality in business matters, and he had these extraordinary code words, which I'll just briefly tell you about, an example of the way he kept what he was doing secret. This is a cable from Dundee to Robert Fleming in the United States. Your letter of 7th of April, 1873 received. Badajoz, Talavero, Inkerman and Balaclava. Now, each of these 4 words was a code for making an investment of $60,000 in a particular stock. And there was a 5th one missing, Waterloo, from the reply. And this meant that the trustees in Dundee didn't like the look of that investment, which would have been in the Missouri, Toledo, Wabash and Western Railroad. His other key points and hallmarks, in my view, were he believed in portfolio diversification, constant monitoring of adjustment of that portfolio, and not last but not least, integrity and reputation. But when Robert himself was asked in later life what he said was the key to his success, he said, learn to say no. And I think that's quite relevant in the investment world today, where people are constantly being offered tips, shares, and so on and so forth. You have to say no to them. Moving now towards the end of Robert's life, at the age of 86, he was still going into the London office at 10:30 every day, believe it or not. His assistant would read out his letters, items of financial news and so on, and sometimes the secretary thought that Robert had nodded off, sneaked back to his desk, but in fact he'd be recalled and told to carry on. He died at the age of 88 in July 1933. He was buried in his village churchyard in Oxfordshire, as he'd wished. His coffin was carried by 6 of his employees to a simple grave lined with moss, flowers and heather. Turning lastly to Robert Fleming as a benefactor. Now, among his largest known bequests is a thing called the Fleming Trust Housing Scheme in Dundee, where in his later years he paid for 500 units of what might be called social housing for lower income families. And these still exist today, Fleming Gardens, north and south. I've been up there to see them, and that was his way of giving something back to the city of his birth. He donated to numerous other causes, large and small. It could be something as simple as a village hall in Oxfordshire, or it could be, large amounts to hospitals, and no publicity was received. He as a consequence of the Fleming Trust housing scheme, he was given the freedom of Dundee. Later the same day that the Duchess of York had laid the foundation stone. She was the future Queen Mother, incidentally. But that was the only award Fleming ever got. It's rumoured he was offered knighthoods and peerships and all the peerages, but turned them down. He just wanted to be plain Robert Fleming. So in conclusion, I'd describe Robert Fleming as a true Scottish financial entrepreneur, a very fine man, and he should be up there with Andrew Carnegie and all the rest of them. Thank you very much.